So, Lone Rider here, and seeing as I now have a proper one-handed sword, I thought I would learn how to use it. Some people at the local HEMA club are talking about where to get copies of I-33, or as some people know it, 133. That's um, the earliest known proper sword manual, and that one in particular is, of course, Sword and Buckler. So it deals with a one-handed sword used in conjunction with essentially a small mobile shield. Um, Now I've got my hands on some of the PDFs. I don't have a published book version yet, but from what I understand, those are fairly dear and hard to come by. See what happens as far as getting one of those. But I did want to talk about this. This is a crude homemade facsimile of a buckler. And the reason I did this is basically because, the sword is here. I'm glad to have it. But I didn't have, a lot of cash lying around to send out for a buckler. Now, bucklers are fairly inexpensive, depending on whether you're getting a synthetic one or whether you're getting a metal one and what gauge metal. They're usually made out of, 14 or 16 gauge steel. Um, they don't cost all that much, $35, $20, $25, something like that. But of course, with shipping, that ends up being, 50 or $60. So I figured all I really need right now is something just to practice with solo, to get the hang of, you know, um, using it in conjunction with the sword to protect the hand and all of that. So, because the only thing I've ever taken classes in is longsword, and the longsword is a solo use weapon. It's both the weapon of attack and defense. You don't use it with an offhand dagger. You don't use it with a shield. You don't use it with a buckler. So, um, the whole idea of using two things at the same time is new to me and fairly daunting. And I have no idea how to do it. I'll be upfront about that. So, um, but I'm interested in learning, of course. That's life is learning, and I figured the first thing I could do is just make something myself that doesn't cost anything with what I have lying around that I can at least have something to practice with that's durable enough that if it was to actually take a hit or two, it's not gonna shatter into a bazillion pieces, but that is not necessarily professionally made. And so I put this together. Now I'll talk about how I did it in case anybody's interested in making their own. But basically, I would not recommend doing it the way I did it only because I took a few shortcuts. So basically, what I did is I cut out the main shape from wood. And historically, some of them were made out of wood with a metal boss. A lot of the reproduction ones we get now are all made out of metal because that's fairly easy to do. But remember during the Middle Ages, especially the earlier Middle Ages, steel was fairly dear and hard to come by. So a poorer guy might have a buckler that was made out of wood with a metal boss, whereas a more well-to-do person might have a buckler that was all metal. It depended on the time period and on the individual. Um, but wooden ones with metal bosses certainly did exist, much like a lot of Dark Age shield, Viking Age shields in particular. You see them; they're wood covered with material, and then they have a metal boss in the center. And the boss is there because unlike being strapped to the forearm like later shields, these are held in the fist. So uh, there's a cutout so that your knuckles don't rub against the inside of the shield, and then to cover that cutout, you have the boss. Um, and I basically, so the first thing I did is I cut this general shape out of wood, and then I cut a hole in the back. Now it doesn't give clearance for my whole hand because I was trying to avoid weakening the thing. Since I used softwood for this, and that's the first thing I wouldn't recommend. If I was going to, actually buy supplies and then make my own properly, I would have bought hardwood, but I just used what was lying around in the scrap heap. So this is made out of pine, which is not a good choice for a shield. But like I said, this is intended mainly for solo practice, just to get the hang of using the two things together. I don't expect to take it to, full on sparring or anything. So that's just what it is. So I cut it out, and I cut out the center to give clearance. So my middle knuckles, if you can see there, go up into it, and then the boss covers that. The boss itself is just a stainless steel bowl. People have said don't use like a bowl from the kitchen because it's too thin, and you're not going to be able to have it withstand a lot of use. Undoubtedly, this is not going to withstand the same amount of use as a properly made shield boss. However, you will notice there's a variety of dents in it, and I'll illustrate that here. There's another dent, right? Actually, that one didn't dent it, oddly enough. But anyway, the point is, I hit this with swords a couple times, fairly hard, just to see if it would break, and it hasn't broken. It has dented, as you'll see, but not very deeply, and not it hasn't cracked. So for what I want to do with it, it's fine. And I guess I could even do light drills, at least in terms of the boss. Now, how I attached it was I drilled 4 holes. Now you'll notice there's 2 nails, and they're rib nails, so they can't pull out. They go through the other side, they're cut off, and then they're sort of peened over. These other 2 holes are going to have screws or bolts that go through them with nuts on the other side, but I haven't gotten around to getting screws or nuts that are of the requisite thinness to go through the holes that I've drilled on the edge. And I just can't be bothered to go down to the hardware store right now, so when I get a chance, I'll do that. This is, like I said, I just wanted something to have that I could hold in my hand to work with to get the hang of using the 2 things in conjunction. But if you wanted to build a more durable one, you'd use 4 bolts going all the way through, and then nuts and washers on the other side. In conjunction with my idea of doing this on the cheap, rather than going to the trouble to make a proper bar, I just used a leather grip, literally piece of a belt. There's 4 screws, 2 on each side, holding it in place, and it allows you to grip it the way you normally would grip it. It's just, it was what I had lying around. Normally there's a bar going across, and that's what you grip, but oh well. Now, to reinforce the edge, I took an old bicycle tire, and you can't see it from the front, but if you flip it around, it actually says Michelin Highlight Super Comp, and then you have the tire size. This was a 700 by 20 millimeter tire, so this was a fairly narrow, skinny one. And actually, I have a piece of it here. And basically, all I did was I cut this to the length, and I wrapped it around, and then where it came to the end, I overlapped it about that much. And I just tacked it down with staple gun going around the edges, and then in the front as well as the back. Now, the purpose of this is twofold. One, it's to protect the edge, just reinforce it a little bit. Historically, a lot of shields did have edges, and when I've seen people make like replicas, for example, of a Dark Age shield, a Viking shield, that sort of thing, which is similar in construction to this overall, except obviously larger. What you would have is raw hide or something around the edge. And the idea is that would prevent, if somebody hits it with a sword, even a blunt sword, it could dig into the wood and cut into the wood. But with this, you have something there to cushion the impact and sort of protect the edge. The other thing you have is it's going to, so in addition to making the shield a little more durable, or the buckler in this case, if you do happen to hit somebody with it and the buckler was mobile, you moved it with your hand, with the sword. So there was always the possibility that somebody could get hit with it, that somebody actually would strike with one, either in the face or with the edge. If you do happen to bump your training partner, having the edge wrapped with a rubber tire, it's going to be maybe a little friendlier than if you were to just hit them with the hardwood edge. So it protects the sword, and it protects other people if you were to use it in, let's say, the context of light drilling or something. Now, the steps I skipped, in addition to not having a bar handle, having a strap instead that I grip, is covering the face. And normally you would cover it with glue, smear it all over with glue, and then you would put a fabric covering of some kind, which would usually wrap around the sides. That would be done before you put the edge on. And again, it's to protect the shield, to keep it from splitting if it's hit, etc. Now, obviously, this isn't an issue with a metal one, but with a wood one, with just a metal boss, that could be done. Again, I basically wanted something just for solo practice, so this isn't going to get hit all that much, so that to me wasn't an issue. And I could always make another one. I made this in an afternoon. It didn't take all that long, so there's that. But I just wanted to throw that out there. If you're looking at, hey, I want to get into a single-handed sword, maybe all I've done before is longsword, maybe rapier or saber or whatever it is, and you actually want to try sword and buckler, and it's like, okay, swords are easy enough to get if you have the money, but what do you do for a buckler? Especially if, for example, you spent all your money on a sword. Well, it is possible to make your own, or to make your own, let's say, crude facsimile. And like I said, between the bike tire and everything else, I mean, this was basically made with what I had lying around the house. There's nothing particularly special about this. There's nothing, I didn't have to buy any parts or any materials. If you want to have something just to get the hang of practicing with a single-handed sword in its historical context, which often would be with a buckler, in this case, you can do that, and it's fairly easy to make one. So I just thought I'd throw that out there. Now that I do have a proper single-handed sword, it's nice to maybe give a try learning how to actually use it. And this was part of that. One of the reasons these swords had the hilt shapes and the other stuff they do. I mean, you look at later medieval swords, which usually weren't used with bucklers or shields, and they had longer cross guards, and I don't know other things. This was very much a product of the fact that it was a system. I don't have any practical experience with sword and buckler, but from what I've read about it, and I've read quite a bit, I'll make the analogy as a cyclist to something that anybody who bikes is probably familiar with, which is bottom brackets. The cranks on a bicycle attach to what's called the bottom bracket, which can refer to both the bottom bracket shell in the frame of the bike and the bottom bracket itself. This is a set of bearing cups or flanges that hold the bearings themselves, and then a spindle which runs through. Now, that's a traditional bottom bracket. A lot of ones lately, it's integrated into one or more of the crank arms, etc. There's a whole variety of things. And then there's press fit bottom brackets like the BB30, which actually do away with the bearing cups and the flanges. They're supposedly lighter and stiffer. Of course, they're press fit into the frame, so that has its own problems, lack of adjustability. A lot of times you end up with a $5,000 Cervelo that squeaks. So yes, it does have a lighter, stiffer bottom bracket, but that means nothing because that squeaking is a sign of movement, and essentially, the weak spot in the transfer of energy from your feet through the cranks to the bottom bracket to the drivetrain is where that bottom bracket interfaces with the frame, and there's all sorts of things I won't go into that have more to do with bikes and swords than that. But basically, the cranks are designed the way they're designed to work with a particular type of bottom bracket. If you're talking about the traditional kind where it's a discrete bottom bracket and it's not built into one or more parts of the cranks. And the problem you sometimes find if you're hanging out at the bike shop, as I often do, you'll see people come in with a bike where they put their own cranks on it, but they haven't changed the bottom bracket to match those cranks. And those cranks are designed to work with a bottom bracket that usually has a particular spindle length. So what you often end up with is the cranks are too far in or too far out. The gears don't line up. It doesn't shift. If it's a single-speed bike, you could be at risk of dropping or throwing a chain because you have what's called poor chain line. The gear is either too far out or too far in, and it's not straight, and it's more liable to come off to get thrown. Basically, the bottom bracket and the cranks, where they're not integrated, like in the newer BB30 models, the bottom bracket and the cranks are discrete parts, but they're designed to work together as a system. And in many cases, from what I've read about it anyway, that's very similar to what you see in the situation with something like Sword and Shield or Sword and Buckler. Yes, you can use a sword by itself, and no doubt that was done historically, but the swords that were specifically intended to be used by themselves, or to be used, for example, in armor, such as in the later medieval period, had different features. They might have been overall broadly similar in terms of, well, it's a straight double-edged sword with a crossguard, but the crossguard's going to be longer, the pommel's going to be a different shape, the blade's going to be a different type, etc. And all of that is dictated by the fact that you're not using it with a shield, and what are you using it with? Usually either by itself in civilian clothes or in an armored military context. So I just wanted to throw that out there. If you want to get into single-handed sword and you do want a buckler on the cheap, you don't feel like spending $60 shipped from Cult of Athena or any of the other purveyors out there. This is a quick and dirty way to make one. And like I said, I made this in an afternoon. It didn't take all that much time. It's fairly easy to do. One thing I would suggest, and this is something I did, just so I can hang it up on the wall, because it does kind of look cool. I put a little screw in the back, and it's a screw that's designed to go into a recessed or chamfered hole, but there is none. So you end up with sort of the head is flat on the back, and then it sort of tapers out to it. So there's a narrow space around the head. You can see I'm putting my fingernails in there. I have a hook made of bent wire on the wall, and when I want to hang this up, like so, I just hook it under the head of that screw, and it just hangs there like that. So it looks kind of cool, especially I've got the sword on a rack next to it. Just something to think about. But while this may not be as functional as something like a buckler you'd buy from a professional purveyor, you can make them. A lot of people just buy the Shield Boss and make their own out of wood. I would use hardwood or something more durable, and I would cover the face. But beyond that, this is a quick and dirty way to do it, and it just gives you something just to get the hang of using the sword with the buckler, because that's a totally different thing than longsword, where it's literally a solo weapon. The sword is both the weapon of attack and defense. So anyway, now that I have one of these swords and I got myself a buckler, I got to go and figure out what to do with them, and hopefully not break a lamp or something in the process. Lone Rider out.